The Japanese term Kirishitan, from Portuguese cristão, referred to Roman Catholic Christians in Japanese and is used in Japanese texts as a historiographic term for Roman Catholics in Japan in the 16th and 17th centuries. Modern Japanese has several ways of spelling Christian, of which the most common of the noun form kirisuto, kyôto, and also kirisuchan. The Japanese spelling Kirishitan is used primarily in Japanese texts for the early history of Roman Catholicism in Japan, or in relation to kakure Kirishitan, hidden Christians. However, English sources on histories of Japan generally use the term Christian without distinction. History. Christian missionaries were known as Batran or Arumin. Both the transcriptions and came into use during the Edo period when Christianity was a forbidden religion. The kanji used for the transcriptions have negative connotations. The first one could be read as cut off support, and the second as devils who profit from death. Portuguese ships began arriving in Japan in 1543, with Catholic missionary activities in Japan beginning in earnest around 1549, mainly by Portuguese-sponsored Jesuits until Spanish-sponsored mendicant orders, such as the Franciscans and Dominicans, gained access to Japan. Of the 95 Jesuits who worked in Japan up to 1600, 57 were Portuguese, 20 were Spaniards and 18 Italian. Francis Xavier, Cosmo de Torres, and João Fernandes were the first to arrive to Kagoshima with hopes to bring Christianity and Catholicism to Japan. At its height, Japan is estimated to have had around 300,000 Christians. Catholicism was subsequently repressed in several parts of the country and ceased to exist publicly in the 17th century. Line of demarcations between Portugal and Spain. Religion was an integral part of the state, and evangelization was seen as having both secular and spiritual benefits for both Portugal and Spain. Indeed, Pope Alexander VI's bulls of donation commanded the Catholic monarchs to take such steps. Wherever Spain and Portugal attempted to expand their territories or influence, missionaries would soon follow. By the Treaty of Tordesillas, the two powers divided the world between them into exclusive spheres of influence, trade and colonization. Although at the time of the demarcation, neither nation had any direct contact with Japan, that nation fell into the sphere of the Portuguese. The countries disputed the attribution of Japan. Since neither could colonize it, the exclusive right to propagate Christianity in Japan meant the exclusive right to trade with Japan. Portuguese-sponsored Jesuits under Alessandro Valeriano took the lead in proselytizing in Japan over the objection of the Spaniards. The fait accompli was approved in Pope Gregory XIII's papal bull of 1575, which decided that Japan belonged to the Portuguese Diocese of Macau. In 1588, the Diocese of Ferney was founded under Portuguese protection. In rivalry with the Jesuits, Spanish-sponsored mendicant orders entered into Japan via Manila. While criticizing Jesuit activities, they actively lobbied the Pope. Their campaigns resulted in Pope Clement VIII's decree of 1600, which allowed Spanish friars to enter Japan via the Portuguese Indies, and Pope Paul V's decree of 1608, which abolished the restrictions on the route. The Portuguese accused Spanish Jesuits of working for the homeland instead of the patron. The power struggle between Jesuits and mendicant orders caused a schism within the Diocese of Ferney. Furthermore, mendicant orders tried in vain to establish a diocese on the Tohoku region that was to be independent from the Portuguese one. The Roman Catholic world order was challenged by the Netherlands and England. Theoretically, it was repudiated by Grotius's Mare Liberum. In the early 17th century, Japan built trade relations with the Netherlands and England. Although England withdrew from the operations in 10 years under James I due to lack of profitability, the Netherlands continued to trade with Japan and became the only European country that maintained trade relations with Japan until the 19th century. As trade competitors, the Protestant countries engaged in a negative campaign against Catholicism, and it subsequently affected shogunate policies toward the Iberian kingdoms. Portugal's and Spain's colonial policies were also challenged by the Roman Catholic Church itself. The Vatican founded the Congregatio de Propaganda Fide in 1622 and attempted to separate the churches from the influence of the Iberian kingdoms. However, it was too late for Japan. The organization failed to establish staging points in Japan. Propagation strategy. The Jesuits believed that it was better to seek to influence people in power and then allow the religion to be passed downwards to the commoners. Later, they tried to avoid suspicion by not preaching to the commoners without permission from the local rulers to propagate Catholicism within their domains. As a result, several daimyo became Christians, soon to be followed by many of the subjects as the Dominicans and Augustinians were able to begin preaching to the commoners. After the edict banning Christianity, there were communities that kept practicing Catholicism without having any contact with the church until missionaries were able to return much later. When Xavier disembarked in Kagoshima, the principal chiefs of the two branches of the Shimizu family, Sanefisa and Katsuhisa, were warring for the sovereignty of the lands. Katsuhisa adopted Takahisa Shimizu, who in 1542 was accepted as head of the clan, having previously received the Portuguese merchants on Tanegashima Island, learning about the use of firearms. Later, he met Xavier himself at the castle of Uchi-Uchijo and permitted the conversion of his vassals. Having a religious background, Takahisa showed himself to be benevolent and already allowed freedom of worship, but not helping the missionaries nor favoring the church. Failing to find a way to the center of affairs, the court of the emperor, Xavier soon tired and left to Yamaguchi, thus beginning the Yamaguchi period. Xavier stayed in Yamaguchi for 2 months on his way to an abortive audience with the emperor in Kyoto. Yamaguchi was already a prosperous and refined city, and its leaders, the Aochi family, were aware that Xavier's journey to Japan had begun after the completion of his mission in India. They took Catholicism for some sort of new sect of Buddhism and were curious to know of the priest's doctrine. Tolerant but shrewd, their eyes less on baptism than the Portuguese cargoes from Macau, they granted the Jesuit permission to preach. The uncompromising Xavier took to the streets of the city, denouncing, among other things, infanticide, idolatry and homosexuality. Misunderstandings were inevitable. Christian books were published in Japanese from the 1590s on, some with more than 1,000 copies, and from 1601 a printing press was established under the supervision of Swagoto Thomas, a citizen of Nagasaki, with 30 Japanese working full-time at the press. Liturgical calendars were also printed after 1592 until at least 1634. Christian solidarity made also possible missionary mail delivery throughout the country until the end of the 1620s. Nature of early Christian community. Different groups of laymen supported Christian life in Japanese mission, e.g., dojokus, kanbo and jihi-yakusha helped the clergyman in activities like the celebration of Sunday liturgy in the absence of ordained clergy, religious education, preparation of confessions, and spiritual support of the sick. By the end of the 16th century, kanbo and jihi-yakusha yakuza had similar responsibilities and also organized funerals and baptized children with permission to baptize from Rome. The kanbo were those who had left secular life but not taken formal vows, while the jihi yakuza were married and had a profession. These groups were fundamental to the mission, and themselves depended on both the ecclesiastical hierarchy as well as the warlords who controlled the lands where they lived. Therefore, the success of the Japanese mission cannot be explained only as the result of the action of a brilliant group of missionaries, or of the commercial and political interests of a few daimyo and traders. At the same time, the missionaries faced the hostility of many other daimyo. Christianity challenged Japanese civilization, a militant lay community. The main reason for missionary success in Japan was also the main reason for the anti-Christian policy of the Tokugawa's bakufu. Economic activities. The Jesuits in Japan had to maintain economic self-sufficiency because they could not expect stable and sufficient payment from the patron, the King of Portugal, the king allowing the Jesuits to engage in trade with Japan. Such economic activity can be found in the work of Francis Xavier, the pioneer of Catholic missions in Japan, who covered the cost of missionary work through merchant trading. For the 1550s to the 1570s, the Jesuits covered all necessary expenses with trade profits and bought land in India. Their officially recognized commercial activity was a fixed amount entry into the Portuguese silk trade between Macau and Nagasaki. They financed to a certain amount the trade association in Macau, which purchased raw silk in Canton and sold it in Nagasaki. They did not confine their commercial activity to the official silk market but expanded into unauthorized markets. For the Macau-Nagasaki trade, they dealt in silk fabrics, gold, musk and other goods including military supplies and slavery. Sometimes, they even got involved in Spanish trade, prohibited by the kings of Spain and Portugal, and antagonized the Portuguese traders. It was mainly procurators who brokered Portuguese trade. They resided in Macau and Nagasaki, and accepted purchase commitments by Japanese customers such as the shogunate daimyo and wealthy merchants. By brokerage, the Jesuits could expect not only rebates but also favorable treatment from the authorities. For this reason, the office of procurator became an important post amongst the Jesuits in Japan. Although trade activities by the Jesuits ate into Portuguese trade interests, procurators continued the brokerage utilizing the authority of the Catholic Church. At the same time, Portuguese merchants required the assistance of procurators who were familiar with Japanese customs, since they established no permanent trading post in Japan. Probably the most notable procurator was João Rodrigues, who approached Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu and even participated in the administration of Nagasaki. Such commercial activities were contrary to the idea of honorable poverty that the priests held, but some Jesuits at this time placed the expansion of the society's influence before this ideal. Mendicant orders fiercely accused the Jesuits of being corrupt and even considered their activity as the primary reason for Japan's ban on Catholicism. Mendicant orders themselves were not necessarily uninvolved in commercial activities. Military activities. Missionaries were not reluctant to take military action if they considered it an effective way to Christianize Japan. They often associated military action against Japan with the conquest of China. They thought that well-trained Japanese soldiers who had experienced long civil wars would help the countries conquer China. For example, Alessandro Valiniano said to the Philippine governor that it was impossible to conquer Japan because the Japanese were very brave and always received military training, but that Japan would benefit them when they would conquer China. Francisco Cabral also reported to the King of Spain that priests were able to send to China 2,000 or 3,000 Japanese Christian soldiers who were brave and were expected to serve the king with little pay. The Jesuits provided various kinds of support, including military support to Kirishitan daimyo when they were threatened by non-Kirishitan daimyo. Most notable was the support of Omura Sumatada and Arima Harunobu, who fought against the anti-Catholic Usurgi clan. In the 1580s, Valiniano believed in the effectiveness of military action and fortified Nagasaki and Mogi. In 1585, Gaspar Coelho asked the Spanish Philippines to send a fleet, but the plan was rejected due to the shortness of its military capability. Christians Arima Harunobu and Paulo Okamoto were named as principals in an assassination plot to murder the magistrate in charge of the shogunate's most important port city of Nagasaki. Early policy toward Catholicism. When the Jesuit priest Francis Xavier arrived, Japan was experiencing a nationwide civil war. Neither the emperor nor the Ashikaga shogun could exercise power over the nation. At first, Xavier planned to gain permission for building a mission from the emperor, but was disappointed with the devastation of the imperial residence. The Jesuits approached daimyo in southwestern Japan and succeeded in converting some of these daimyo. One reason for the conversion may have been the Portuguese trade, in which the Jesuits acted as brokers. The Jesuits recognized this and approached local rulers with offers of trade and exotic gifts. The Jesuits attempted to expand their activity to Kyoto and the surrounding regions. In 1559, Gaspar Viola obtained permission from Ashikaga Yoshiteru to teach Christianity. This license was the same as those given to Buddhist temples, so special treatment cannot be confirmed regarding the Jesuits. On the other hand, Emperor Ogimachi issued edicts to ban Catholicism in 1565 and 1568. The orders of the emperor and the shogun made little difference. Christians refer positively to Oda Nobunaga, who died in the middle of the unification of Japan. He favored the Jesuit missionary Luis Froy and generally tolerated Christianity, but overall, he undertook no remarkable policies toward Catholicism. Actually, Catholic power in his domain was trivial because he did not conquer Western Japan, where the Jesuits were based. By 1579, at the height of missionary activity, there were about 130,000 converts. Toyotomi Hideyoshi and the Christian daimyo. The situation was changed when Toyotomi Hideyoshi reunified Japan. Once he became the ruler of Japan, Hideyoshi began to pay attention to external threats, particularly the expansion of European power in East Asia. The turning point for Catholic missions was the San Felipe incident, where in an attempt to recover his cargo, the Spanish captain of a shipwrecked trading vessel claimed that the missionaries were there to prepare Japan for conquest. These claims made Hideyoshi suspicious of the foreign religion. He attempted to curb Catholicism while maintaining good trading relations with Portugal and Spain, which might have provided military support to Dom Justo Takayama, a Christian daimyo in western Japan. Many daimyos converted to Christianity in order to gain more favorable access to saltpeter used to make gunpowder. Between 1553 and 1620, 86 daimyos were officially baptized, and many more were sympathetic to the Christians. By 1587, Hideyoshi had become alarmed, not because of too many converts but rather because the hegemon learned that Christian lords reportedly oversaw forced conversions of retainers and commoners, that they had garrisoned the city of Nagasaki, that they participated in the slave trade of other Japanese and, apparently offending Hideyoshi's Buddhist sentiments, that they allowed the slaughter of horses and oxen for food. After his invasion of Kyushu, Hideyoshi Toyotomi promulgated the Purge Directive Order to the Jesuits on July 24, 1587. It consists of 11 articles. Number 10. Do not sell Japanese people to the Namban. Quote, among the contents were a ban on missionaries. The Jesuits in Nagasaki considered armed resistance, but the plans did not come to fruition. Led by Coelho, they sought help from Kirishitan daimyo, but the daimyo refused. Then they called for a deployment of reinforcements from the homeland and its colonies, but this plan was abolished by Valeriano. Like the Kirishitan daimyo, he realized that a military campaign against Japan's powerful ruler would bring catastrophe to Catholicism in Japan. The Valeriano survived the crisis by laying all the blame on Coelho, and in 1590, the Jesuits decided to stop intervening in the struggles between the daimyo and to disarm themselves. They only gave secret shipments of food and financial aid to Kirishitan daimyo. However, the 1587 decree was not particularly enforced. In contrast to the Jesuits, the Dominicans, Franciscans, and Augustinians were openly preaching to the common peoples. This caused Hideyoshi to become concerned that commoners with divided loyalties might lead to dangerous rebels like the Ekoiki sect of earlier years. This led to Hideyoshi putting the 26 martyrs of Japan followers to death in 1597. On his order, after Hideyoshi died in 1598, amidst the chaos of succession there was less of a focus on persecuting Christians. Expansion. By the end of the 16th century, the Japanese mission had become the largest overseas Christian community that was not under the rule of a European power. Its uniqueness was emphasized by Alessandro Valeriano since 1582, who promoted a deeper accommodation of Japanese culture. Japan was then the sole overseas country in which all members of those confraternities were locals, as was the case with Christian missions in Mexico, Peru, Brazil, the Philippines, or India, in spite of the presence of a colonial elite. Most Japanese Christians lived in Kyushu, but Christianization was not a regional phenomenon and had a national impact. By the end of the 16th century it was possible to find baptized people in virtually every province of Japan, many of them organized in communities. On the eve of the Sekigahara battle, 15 daimyo were baptized, and the domains stretched from Hyuga in southeast Kyushu to Dewa in North Honshu. Hundreds of churches had been built throughout Japan. Accepted on a national scale, Christianity was also successful among different social groups from the poor to the rich, peasants, traders, sailors, warriors, or courtesans. Most of the daily activities of the church were done by Japanese from the beginning, giving the Japanese church a native face, and this was one of the reasons for its success. By 1590, there were 70 native brothers in Japan, fully one-half of Jesuits in Japan and 15% of all Jesuits who were working in Asia. In June 1592, Hideyoshi invaded Korea. Among his leading generals was Christian daimyo Konishi Yukinaga. The actions of his forces in the massacre and enslavement of many of the Korean people were indistinguishable from the non-Christian Japanese forces that participated in the invasion. After Konishi's loss in the Battle of Sekigahara, Konishi would base his refusal to commit seppuku on his Christian beliefs. Instead of taking his own life, he chose capture and execution. The 1592 war between Japan and Korea also provided Westerners with a rare opportunity to visit Korea. Under orders of Gomez, the Jesuit Gregorius de Cespedes arrived in Korea with a Japanese monk for the purposes of administering to the Japanese troops. He stayed there for approximately 18 months, until April and May 1595, thus being on record as the first European missionary to visit the Korean peninsula but was unable to make any inroads. The annual letters of Japan made substantial contribution to the introduction of Korea to Europe. Francis Xavier, having crossed paths with Korean envoys dispatched to Japan during 1550 and 1551, the Japanese missions were economically self-sufficient. Nagasaki's misericordias became rich and powerful institutions which every year received large donations. The Brotherhood grew in numbers to over 100 by 1585 and 150 in 1609. Controlled by the elite of Nagasaki, and not by Portuguese. It had 2 hospitals and a large church. By 1606, there already existed a feminine religious order called Miyako no Bikuni which accept Korean convents such as Marina Pak. Baptized in Nagasaki. Nagasaki was called the Rome of Japan, and most of its inhabitants were Christians. By 1611, it had 10 churches and was divided into 8 parishes including a specifically Korean order.